Good evening, everyone.
Good evening
Hi.
again.
We missed you last week.
We missed you last week.
Yeah,
I want to welcome everyone who missed us last week to episode 471, Comprehending the Depth and Love of Brotherhood in the New Covenant Passover. And this will be part one. So, Dr. Ricks, if you would start us out, that would be
okay. Because this subject is so deep, this is the last groaner you're going to hear for 2 weeks. This is a real groaner. The guy says, "My car has COVID." He says, "How do you know your car has COVID?" Well, there are two bumps on the battery, and one tested positive, and it's really terminal. So that's it for the next 2 weeks. We're going to get into the depth, comprehend the depth of love and brotherhood in the New Covenant Passover Part 1. And I think Part 2 will even be, well, I think it will be better than Part 1. What we want to start off with is that Jesus Christ put unparalleled love and fellowship into that Passover service with his 12 disciples in that last night on earth. By the way, in case some people are like, well, that wasn't really a Passover. We don't go through them all, but if you check all the Gospels, they all say Passover service with Christ. I mean, so you can go through all four Gospels and you will see they thought it was the Passover. So no matter what people speculate today what it was, they said it was the Passover. And so I want to emphasize the enthusiasm and the warmth in which Jesus wanted to enjoy this last fellowship with his brethren. Ken, would you go to 13:1, please? John 13:1.
It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world. It was time for him to go to the Father. Jesus loved his disciples who were in the world, so he now showed them how much he really loved them.
There are other translations put in word like vividly, like them, but I think the NIV gets it pretty well. One of the purposes for these, I call it New Covenant Passover, was to show his disciples how much he loved them and to get them to love each other. This was really important to Christ, more than I think we appreciate.
I think it ties in really well with his exhortation a little later on in verse 35 of the same chapter. It says, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one to another." It's like he did with the foot washing. He's setting the example there. That's the example for us as well. He's going to show. He's going to show the whole world how much he has potentially, and for those people in the room specifically, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and we're going to explore the depth and richness in the next two podcasts and see what I call the depth that Christ put into the New Covenant Passover. And I believe it's vital to our spiritual growth. And I guess we kind of know it, but maybe we can learn it even more so than we have in the past. Ken, let's look at Luke 22:14, please.
When the hour had come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. Then he said to them with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer.
Think about fervent desire. And wouldn't it be logical to say, if it was that important to Christ, it should be that important to us?
Surely it was. And I believe that he was, he was trying to comfort them, because he knew what he was about to go through. And he knew that they were going to feel bewildered and lost, and they did. And as we were talking earlier, they, maybe they thought even at that point that his, kingdom was going to be established right then. And so the huge disappointment that would happen that night, even when he told Peter, before the night's over, you're going to betray me, 3 times. And he knew they were going to have a big letdown, and so he was trying to encourage them. And I think he made several points there when he made that last speech to them, is about the peace they were going to have, the power of the Holy Spirit, how they were going to receive God's Spirit again, but also, he gave them instructions about his departure, but also about his return. And I think they probably didn't see all of that right then and there, but later on they would remember his words and what he had promised them.
And the epoch that's about to happen in history, next, the most significant thing in the story of God's relationship with his people, since the Exodus, since he took them out of slavery and, led them into the promised land. And, that took a little longer than they thought it was going to as well. Right. And just such an important national holiday as well with them, and what it meant to their people, and him knowing what they were going to go through, like you said, to be deprived of him at that point in time right afterwards as well, and have to go on. But the cusp of what the world was on, it's another world shaking epoch, like the Israelites leaving Egypt.
And history is full of documents. As one, I think the guys on the road to Emmanuel says, are you the only one that doesn't know all the big events that have happened in Jerusalem the last few days? It was a big deal. And we could argue it was maybe the biggest event in world history. And I don't think they realized it then, but it became so.
The role of Christianity in forming the world the way that it is right now it's undeniable. Whether you believe it or not, that's there. It's a huge part of it. It's a huge part of history.
We were talking earlier that the Passover is probably one of the longest Jewish traditions, observances, and even into Christianity that has ever been around. And they consider it the holiest time of the year and the most important of the holy days. And even Christianity, that understands the implication and the meaning behind the symbols of Jesus, and as did the disciples, I've no doubt later on, they realized the connection and the significance between the ancient Passover and the observance that Jesus had just committed to them, that they realized the significance of what each of those symbols, and anciently what the predecessor meant, and it all looked forward to his time and to his sacrifice.
Yeah. And I like to keep in mind that it's a time of family, like your family is together. You get together for this event. You rejoice. It is a feast of unleavened bread. It's a serious time, and it marks a serious thing. Spiritually, obviously, the symbolism is overwhelming. It means the world to each and every one of us. But it was also a time of togetherness and camaraderie, and think of who he's with, and he wants to sing a song with them in the mood behind the whole thing. I mean, in the context of brotherly love and what this episode is about, that's a huge part of it. There's a real bond there. They've been doing something together. His family is involved and well, and it's just all wrapped up. All the good feelings, mom and apple pie, the whole thing.
Even the Jewish people today, even though they don't maybe understand or accept the fact that Jesus was the actual fulfillment of this day in the meaning behind the sacrificial lamb, they understand that it does point to the Messiah, even though they don't recognize him as the Messiah. They have a very serious observance, but you're right, it's family oriented. They actually have their son ask the father, why do we do these things? They do that because they in the Old Testament, God told, or Moses told, or God told Moses that, when your children ask you, why do you observe this? You'll tell them all these reasons. So they actually play that out. They drink the wine and they eat the bitter herbs. I read one article said they eat, radish roots as bitter herbs for that night. And one of the guys, that article I read, he was a Jewish guy. And he remembered that as a child, how awful it was. He said they're starving, but he remembered the impact that these symbols had on that night. But I thought it was really interesting.
It is. Radish roots. I thought the whole radish was a root. I thought the whole just a little tail. You want me?
They ate the bad part of the radish.
They throw away that good part. Just have the little root at the end.
There is a good part, right? No. Radishes are very healthy for you. I
Good
think.
stuff.
By the way, let's take a quick look at the flow chart that Natalie did. I believe we did this 20-some years ago, but it's hard to remember exactly when and where all the information came from.
That was
But
just yesterday, you know. That was just yesterday, you know. 20 years ago.
Yeah, if time really flies, you'd be amazed. We're talking about going to Paris now, all the riots in Paris. Well, we were in Paris about 20 years ago. It doesn't seem like all that long ago. Well, in some ways. Anyway, let's look at the flow chart for a minute, if you can put it up, Ken. This is what we call the standard Church of God perspective on it, where, you know, then each day begins at sunset at night. There's a night and day portion of it. And so the Passover is the 14th. They sacrifice the lamb in the day portion at the evening sacrifice at 3 p.m. But Christ had his meeting with his new symbols of the bread and wine on the night of the 14th. And then they went, of course, to, he spent 20 hours of all kinds of suffering and then died at the exact time the Jews were getting rid of the official Lamb of God. And then, of course, and then the Jews in Israel, if they kill the lamb at about 3 or so, give or take a little, it takes a while to dress, bleed, clean, roast, and get the blood on the doorpost and get inside before dark and then eat it. They'd be eating it the night of the 15th. And that's the night that they left. That's the beginning of unleavened bread. And that's, of course, when Christ was in the grave. And you'll see a little arch there. Christ spent 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. The 2 women did their shopping for spices. You can't shop on the Sabbath on that second day between the Passover and then the weekly Sabbath. And then Christ was resurrected at the end of the weekly Sabbath. And then, of course, Sunday is the wave sheaf offering when the women first came to the to the tomb. And we'll get to all that in just a minute. But we can now move the chart back off, Ken. But I want to just have them look at the chart if they could.
And I posted in the chat room, they can find the chart in the notes section for this program on the LUL.
Good. Thank you, Ken. Okay. So we want to just mention that timing. And also, I think this is worth mentioning. Simultaneous to the Jews killing the official lamb when Christ was there at the temple about evening sacrifice, 3 p.m., at about the exact time, Jesus Christ outside the city walls of Jerusalem died on the stake. And you realize he is the real Passover lamb. You think that through. And the commentators believe at the exact spot on the mountain where Christ died on the stake is where Abraham took Isaac and was prepared to sacrifice him. And in other words, Abraham lived through what the father went through, but the father went all the way through. Abraham didn't have to. But Abraham became father of the faithful because he got to experience what the Father in heaven went through. And in a way, it was harder for the Father than it was for the Son.
You know, it's interesting, you know, later on, you know, the Apostle Paul would say, you know, Christ, our Passover is sacrificed for us. He made that connection later on with the Corinthian church. And he even used the term the Lord's Supper in reference to the night before the original Passover, the ancient Passover, when he offered these symbols, when Jesus offered these symbols of the new covenant of the bread and the wine. Wanted to make a sort of an interesting observation here, I think, is that, you know, when Jesus was there with his disciples, he at the Lord's Supper, And these are sort of proofs that this happened 24 hours earlier. He actually sent Judas out. He washed the disciples' feet. He sent Judas out. And it says the disciples thought that because he held the bag, he was going out to get supplies for the Passover, for the feast days. And on another occasion, it tells us that when Jesus was before Pilate, the Jews wouldn't leave the temple because they didn't want to be defiled before the Passover. This was while he was before Pilate. And then later on, when he was scourged, Pilate scourged Jesus, it tells us, he was beaten by a Roman scourge. They put the crown of thorns on his head, you remember, and he put the purple robe on him, and they said, "Behold your king." And the people were screaming out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And that actual context there says that it was the preparation for the Passover. All of this took place before the Passover. Jesus was actually there being scourged with a crown of thorn on his head and was being, screamed at by a mad mob. And all of this happened after he had had his supper with his disciples and before the actual day of the Passover that the Jews were about to celebrate. So just a little bit of proof there about when Jesus instituted these symbols of the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, about 20 some hours before or maybe more, before the Jews started their official Passover. But it wasn't really the Jews' Passover. It was the Passover for Israel, what I call the Old Covenant Passover. But Christ brought in a New Covenant Passover. Let's go to Exodus 12:6, Ken. Take a look at that scripture, please.
And you shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. And the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And they shall take of the blood and strike it on the two sides posts and upon the upper doorpost of the houses in which they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roasted with fire and unleavened bread. They shall eat it with bitter herbs.
So now remember, they're eating it at night. If they killed it on the 14th, it's going to take a few hours to dress and clean. By the way, Stan, would you like to tell people what it's like to dress and clean an animal and cook it? Because people think, why don't you just do that in the twilight or in the dark, just 10 or 15 minutes? I don't think so.
Well, last time I killed a deer and hung it up, it took a good hour and a half just to skin it, and gut it, and make it get it carved up to where you could even put it in the refrigerator to begin cooling. So it's a pretty laborious job to do, and I know that maybe a lamb or is a little smaller probably could do that a little bit quicker, but obviously it was approaching the Sabbath day. And they couldn't be doing that after dark. And they had to have time also to not only to do all that, to dress it and prepare it, but you remember anciently, the God's instruction where they were to roast this thing. So they needed time to barbecue this, a whole lamb. And I would imagine that took an hour or two to get it done and get it ready so that they could eat it, that evening as the sun began to set.
If you've ever ordered lamb at a restaurant, that's not a quick kind of thing. But if they're going to cook it raw, it's not. I mean, just prepare yourself mentally to sit there for maybe longer than you expected.
Yeah.
You're not kind of.
And so in other words, the Passover was killed on the 14th in the evening, but it was eaten after sunset on the 15th. And that's when the Jews and all of Israel, because it's not just a Jewish holiday, it's the Old Covenant Passover, or some call the night to be much remembered when Israel left Egypt, all of which is historically very important. That's when they ate the unleavened lamb meal. Let's look at Exodus 12:11, please, Ken.
And you shall eat of this the way with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in a hurry. It is the Lord's Passover, for I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, will execute judgments against all the gods of Egypt.
As I understand it, Moses told them, get all this stuff ready. That maybe they did some cooking inside their houses, but But basically, they were told, get this blood on your doorpost before dark and get inside by dark, because we don't know exactly when the death angel is coming. And you can't be outside. You got to be in a house protected by the blood of the Lamb. Then the death angel will come and pass over that house because you got the blood of the Lamb protecting you. And notice they weren't going to spend the whole night in their jammies, sleeping out, and leisurely leave in the morning. They were told to be ready to leave that night because Pharaoh, when his firstborn, all those other people screaming, all the dead people, they told the Israelites, get out quick. Well, and bless me too, but all that's in there. And they start the marshaling process of leaving that very night. And a lot of people argue about, well, this and that, but really that's what the bulk of the evidence shows, that they left at night and they were hurried out of Egypt. And Moses got them ready to be hurried out.
Well,
Yeah, they were prepared, weren't
go
they?
ahead,
Staff in
Michael.
their hand, loins girded, whole thing. They were sitting there ready to walk out the door.
We have this impression of leaving during the day because we've got the movie of 10 Commandments. People have this idea that, Moses walking out there in broad daylight. If you go to, I think it's Deuteronomy, the 16th chapter, in the first verse, it says, they left Egypt by night. It actually states it. Now, I had a conversation with a guy one time about this, about the idea of when all of this took place. But the scriptures actually say that they left by night, and here they were. I jokingly say they gobbled their food down because he said they were to eat in haste. They're eating with their shoes on their feet. They're eating one-handed, while while they're consuming their meal, and they're packed. They've got their kneading troughs bound up in their clothing, so they're ready to go. And they did go in that, I believe, in that night, and they left as soon as Pharaoh gave the order.
I know they knew about unleavened bread in advance, but the symbolism is the reason they didn't have leavened bread is they didn't have time to leaven the bread the way they normally would do it in those days with starters and such. They left in such a hurry. So that's the symbolism. It's unleavened bread. Now, God has other reasons for unleavened bread. It's more pure, but less puffed up. But because they didn't have time to leaven their bread, they left in a hurry. And I think it's when you overlook some of these little things, it makes a difference.
I had an interesting thought about, I wrote my notes, why unleavened bread? And of course, we know the significance of unleavened bread, and, that is the bread of affliction, but why 7 days? And I actually looked this up, and none of the scholars really have a good answer. They really can't determine why God picked 7 days. But, I sort of reflected back on the creation week. God used 7 days, originally. Why wouldn't he pick 7 days for this first feast of the year? But also I found something interesting point, and this is just speculation on my part, but it's interesting to me, is that I went back and looked at when they left Egypt. It tells us that they left Ramses and they went to Sukkoth on the first night when they left. Then they left Sukkoth and went to Etham. And then on Etham, they went to Rehoboth. I apologize for the pronunciation. But somewhere on that third day or so, they crossed, possibly on the fourth day, they crossed the Red Sea. And then it says they went 3 days journey and they landed in a place called Elam. And as I said, this is speculation on my part. But if that was actually 7 days, where did they land in Elam? They came to Elam and there were 12 fountains of water and 70 palm trees there. To me, I think that's not by accident. Was that possibly 7 days that they were eating unleavened bread and then they ended up at a fountain of water and shade and rest? That, to me, I thought it was fascinating.
Well, it makes sense that it's not the 7 days; it's how far they got in 7 days.
Yeah.
That was when they could take time to regroup, get their act together, maybe start some normalcy, because the king's whole army was sitting at the bottom of the Red Sea, so they weren't in any worry. They didn't have to worry about them coming after them, so they could do all the leavening they want at that point.
So it's like they spent the days of unleavened bread getting out of sinful Egypt. Great typology there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
They had to stay ahead of Pharaoh for 3 of those days.
Well, they were completely liberated from Egypt and from their the bondsmen that they had, and I mean the bondage that they were in, and now here they are totally free, and sitting by a beautiful spring and under a palm tree, which they probably never dreamed they would. Because remember, the last day they went to, the last city or the last place that they camped was Mara, where they complained about not having any water, and then the next day there they were at at these palm trees and all of these springs, and there were 70 palms and 12 springs of water, which is God used those numbers as well at very significant times throughout history.
Yeah, one for each tribe, more or less, or something like that. Interesting. So it's clear that Christ kept the New Covenant Passover the night prior to the rest of the nation keeping the Passover. And I want to put out 2 possible reasons why Christ did it. Reason number 1, he had to, because he is the real, that is, Jesus Christ is the real Passover lamb, and he would be in the grave dead because he had spent 3 days and 3 nights, and he was sacrificed. He was going to be sacrificed in 20 some hours. And so he couldn't obviously have this farewell meal with his men, but also he had to die at the exact time when the Passover lamb of Israel died at the temple, because he is the real Passover. In other words, the physical lamb that was killed at the temple is only an icon, a model. The real lamb of Israel, the real lamb that covers our sins permanently, is Jesus Christ. That's reason number 1. The second reason, I think, is that he was also creating something wonderful and additional for true believers, something additional for true believers. We don't just celebrate, I know we celebrate the death and resurrection of Christ, but we also celebrate everything he sacrificed for us, including the comradeship on that last evening.
I had an interesting thought about that too, is why did he do it 24 hours early? And all of those reasons are absolutely correct, because he was going to be the Passover. But when you think about the first time Moses saw him in the burning bush, he said, he said, "What is your name?" And he said, "I am." He said, "I am the God of Abraham." I am. I am that I am. In other words, I'm the self-existent one. And so it is almost as if he is making this statement there that I was before all of these symbols, before all of these observances. And so I'm showing you that I am over all of these even these holy days. I have preeminence over all of them. And there he was, instituting these symbols before even the very first holy day was about to begin.
And they are very focused on love and on camaraderie and on serving each other. I mean, it's a humiliating thing to get down and wash somebody's feet. It's a humiliating thing to have your feet washed by someone, like Peter said, who did not want it to happen, who did not want to get him uncomfortable. But even amongst those that were keeping the law and were pursuing God actively, people like Paul, there was such a harshness to it. There was a I don't know, not the same, welcoming, forgiving, how many times shall I forgive my brother? This many times, and then I'm done with him. No, he's saying, no, we're all in this together, comrade. No, no, but that we're a group. We're forgiving. He is that without sin among you cast the first stone. There's a lot of reconciliation there, and he being the firstborn from the dead and making that opportunity for the rest of the world to follow. I mean, the forgiveness that's in that it's huge. It's the whole enchilada.
It's like I was driving down the road at work today, and I was thinking about my trip where we went up to Tennessee, and you do things in front of God's people. You stand up and have the courage to stand up and sing in front of everybody, which I did, and I wouldn't advise anybody to look at that. But you don't go to work and stand up in front of your coworkers and sing, because you're uncomfortable doing that, being real in front of them, because you have to put on this facade that you're tough and you're invincible and you're serious. And I think I see a little bit of that in the way Peter was acting towards Jesus when Jesus got down and washed his feet. It's like he was so uncomfortable. It was out of his element. If you could imagine doing that at work, you would probably understand how uncomfortable Peter felt when that took place. If you did that among your, the folks at work who have no clue of what you're doing, it would be tremendously embarrassing for them and you probably as well.
And you'd get sent to HR real quick.
Hey, go ask anybody who doesn't know that you're coming if you can wash their feet. see what they say. See what they say.
Ken, someone's on the phone for you for HR.
Yeah.
They want to see you in their office.
And there's a white van outside to pick you up.
Yeah. Get a box.
And there's another part of this that all fits into it as well. The Jewish, actually, when you read all of the context, the Jewish leaders didn't want to do any of this until after the holy days were all over, because they surely didn't want to crucify Christ on the day of when the Passover lamb was done. They wouldn't have wanted to do that. I think God forced their hand, because when he gave Satan the opportunity, he knew Satan like a pit controlled the pit bull. He couldn't pass up the opportunity. He would take it. So they didn't want it, but they also didn't want these dead bodies on the stakes during the holy day of unleavened bread. So they went to Pilate and begged, you got to get those guys dead quicker than normal, get them off the cross and clean up that mess. It's going to mess up our holy day. When
you remember Jesus's triumphal entry into Jerusalem and all the prophetic things attached to that, and the people gathered around, that's a stir. That's a big stir, lighting a fire under the priests. Really making them I don't know. Obviously, what they did was horrendous, but putting them under pressure to do something.
The irony of them, though, saying, let's take the guy down that we murdered so we can celebrate a holy day. I mean, to me, the contrast is so heinous, to think that they were that hypocritical to hide what they were doing and think they could go in and stand before God and be some sort of holy people. That's unbelievable.
Because, that's a bloody mess right out in front of the gates of the city where all the pilgrims come from unleavened bread. Look at that. And also, it did make a martyr of Jesus, and that's the last thing they wanted. I don't know. I guess people could, but they had to get them in the ground before dark. Could you read John 19:31 for us, please, Ken?
Then the Jews begged Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away, so that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day.
And of course, high day means annual Sabbath. It was the first day of unleavened bread. And obviously, Christ fulfilled Christ fulfilled all kinds of prophecy, about 109. But one of them was they were told not to break the bones of the lamb. I'm not even sure why God said that, but that's in the instructions for Passover. And so he had Christ die before the Roman soldiers came. They broke the legs of the other two, but didn't need to do it on Christ to fulfill another prophecy. And so they took him down off the stake. And you realize that they had to wrap people up before they buried them and put certain ointments on them. And when you read the context, they used a tomb near Golgotha because they didn't have time to go further to get him in the ground before dark.
We have to be so thankful to John, who is the only one that recorded this verse right here, that this was a high day. Most of the world thinks that Jesus died on a Good Friday, which, by the way, I want to make a comment about that. If you accept the idea of Good Friday, you have to, because they believed it was the preparation day, you have to know and understand that the Sabbath day, the seventh day Sabbath, was the true Sabbath day. So,
That's true.
They're making that admission by saying it was Good Friday and acknowledging that the preparation day was a Friday. Therefore, Jesus must have been resurrected on a Sunday morning. And you already quoted that Jesus said he was going to be in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. So he couldn't have. But John records here that that Sabbath day was not the weekly Sabbath day, the seventh day, but it was actually a Thursday, which was the first day of unleavened bread. That was the Sabbath day he was referring to. And you look at some of the accounts that it talks about, even when the women came to the tomb, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but some of the commentaries agree that when it mentions Sabbath, it should be rendered after the Sabbaths, plural, they came to the tomb, meaning after the first day of unleavened bread, which was on a Thursday, and after the weekly Sabbath day, which was on the Saturday, then they came to the tomb and found the tomb empty.
Let's go ahead, Ken, and mention, read Matthew 12:39, please.
But he answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth.
So, looking at the flow chart again, as we have to put it up, but if you think about it, 72 hours from, let's say, Wednesday late, maybe 5:30, or maybe right at twilight, right before it got dark for Saturday night. Somewhere in that time frame, the 3 days and 3 nights would be up and Christ would be resurrected. But one thing we do know for sure, he did not rise on Sunday morning. I know they have the sunrise service. Many churches do, to represent Christ rising Sunday morning, but that actually isn't true. Let's go to John 20, verse 1 and see the evidence of it.
Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and the other disciple, said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.
And then others came later, and there are other additional information. But it's quite clear that while it was still dark, maybe 5 a.m., 5:30, Christ was already gone. And it's clear that if he was put in the ground before sunset Wednesday, 3 days from the 14th to the 17th, that's 3 days and 3 nights. It works. It fits all the prophecies and all the Bible.
It's interesting that if you go back and read the fine print, as I would say, it tells us that we already mentioned that how they were eager and in a hurry to take the body down from the stake before the Sabbath day began. If you go read that portion of it, it tells us that the women went to the tomb and they saw how his body was wrapped and where they had laid his body. You don't have that vision in your mind of the women going into a tomb where he was laying already wrapped up, and they wanted to ensure that everything was in order, and then they left. And of course, that was at the very beginning of the Sabbath day, or the high day Sabbath on the holy day. And so we know that they had to go buy the spices, and they didn't buy them the next day on the high day, so they would have bought them on Friday, which was the preparation day. And it actually clearly states that I believe in Luke's account, Mark or Luke's account. It says they bought these spices on that preparation day, and then they observed the Sabbath day. And then when they came Sunday morning, they found the tomb empty. The stone had already been rolled away, and and he was gone.
One of the things that is true, they didn't allow people to roam around graveyards on the Sabbath. They had various Sabbath rules. And so they came as soon as they could, as soon as the Sabbath was over. And they thought, well, a little bit of light may be coming up barely early in the morning. Came as soon as they probably could in a practical sense. And they came and he was gone. It is believed that nobody except possibly the Roman soldiers saw the actual moment of resurrection and angels rolling back the tomb. And as is mentioned in the New Testament, those soldiers ran back into the high priest and others, and they gave them the truth. We got to realize in the Roman Empire, if you were to guard prisoners and the prisoner escaped, guess what would happen to you?
Yeah.
So here's what the priests told them. They said, look, don't tell this story to anybody. Tell people his disciples came and stole the body. We'll pay you a large amount of money to lie, and we will protect you politically from any repercussions for having lost the prisoner. We'll be your political cover. As far as we can tell, that worked the way the high priest said it would work. That creates a second problem. It means at least some of those high priests are guilty of knowing the truth.
Sounds like politics in our day, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. They had to pay somebody to start their chariot for a few years
Well,
after that.
and not only that, but to fabricate a story to take attention away from the truth. People will believe the lie, and it tells us that lie was perpetuated even after this story, on down through time, that they believed and told the story over and over again that, that the disciples stole away his body.
You all know one of the problems with that idea, I know it's still around probably in some communities, is that if the disciples stole Christ's dead body, then buried it somewhere else secretly and claimed it was resurrected, that meant they knew that what they were doing was phony.
Right.
I can see somebody pushing a phony religion as long as it's getting you money and fame. But the moment you start getting persecuted and killed for it, you go, wait a minute, why am I doing this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like Mr. Armstrong used to say, people don't support a cause to the death, that they know is a lie. They would own up to the truth to save their skin, but these men stuck with their story all the way to the very end, and it cost them their life in a lot of cases.
And just from a practical standpoint, I don't think the 12 disciples could have outfought, let's say, a squadron of Roman soldiers. I don't think they could. I mean, they could have, maybe they could have killed a few and it could have been a messy mess. And the Romans probably would have called for reinforcements. I don't think they could have done it if they wanted to. They only had maybe 2 or 3 swords among them, maybe 4. Roman soldiers were hardened, battle-hardened, mean, tough. Well, you've read the story how Roman legions were considered weapons of mass destruction in the ancient world. I don't believe they could have done it even if they wanted to.
Especially after their reaction when they grabbed Jesus, they all turned and ran. They were scared to death. They thought they were going to be next, and they didn't want any. And they were hiding in a room away from all of the activities that were going on, except for probably John, who had the courage to go there and stand out of obligation to Jesus. He loved, he was the one that Jesus loved, and he went down there, was, only one that was recorded standing there at the stake with Mary, the mother of Jesus. The rest of them were gone.
Also, I think one of the bravest ones was actually Peter. At least he picked up his sword. Now, my understanding is he probably tried to split one of the servants' head in the middle. The guy jerked and he cut off his ear. But then when Christ said, we're not going to do that, this is peaceful. But Peter at least followed. The rest were running like cowards and like you said, hiding. Now, Peter's courage did waver later. But the point I'm getting is I don't think they were brave enough, tough enough, This is prior to Pentecost and getting extra spiritual power. They couldn't have taken those Roman soldiers even if they wanted to.
Especially two soldiers that were ordered to guard a grave. They were probably furious about having to be out there all night in the cold guarding a dead body.
And they knew that if they lost the battle, they would probably get executed. So they would be highly motivated. And it would be nice if we had to interview one of the soldiers. I imagine when they saw these angels come and Christ resurrected and roll back the stone, from what we know, it probably scared the you-know-what out of those soldiers. It's something like that before.
Made a couple believers.
Yeah.
Oh, you can bet that.
Well, it's not possible. Years later, some of them might have gotten converted.
They did, even some of Caesar's household during the time of Paul. And that one soldier there at the said, "Surely, truly, this was the Son of God." He actually said that when the earth quaked and the stones rent and people came up out of the grave. He realized this is it. This was the Son of God.
You wonder similarly what the Egyptians thought as the Israelites left. What the firstborn dead. Everybody that didn't take God's warning seriously, the firstborn dead. That's close to every house. And after all those other plagues as well, I bet there were some believers there. Events transpired in such a way that there's no denying it any longer. That happened around Christ, and not to include like the other dead that came out of the tomb and rejoined their families. After he had risen, and God's going to get everybody's attention again someday in an even bigger way. So,
it's interesting you brought that up because, God used, I mean, when you put the two together, the ancient Passover and the one where Jesus laid down his life, God gave his perfect son to judge a nation's sons like those in Egypt, in order to bring about the freedom of the sons of Israel. In each case, he had a purpose. And, if we extrapolate that out to today and we look at what God gave for each of us, his only son, in order that judgment would be passed upon the nation or the world that holds us captive, and brings about our freedom. It is essentially what Paul was saying when he talked about the freedom that we have in Christ, is that we are truly set free from sin.
One more thing about the 12, 12 disciples, because they replaced Judas. Those men went all over the world. As far as we know, after a few years, they lost touch with each other for the most part. They didn't have cell phones, computers, whatever. And as far as we know, all those men did a great work in various parts of the world. And if it were a false religion, totally fake, they say, how do I know that so-and-so John hasn't revealed it as fake? What am I practically martyring myself for, being persecuted for nothing? Those men preached to the very end. We have to assume at least many of them were martyred. We don't know for sure, but it is logical, or at least they suffered greatly for something which they knew was false. Are you kidding me? That's not likely.
Absolutely. It would have been the biggest conspiracy that was kept secret for 50 years, and all the men that were involved died, never breathing a word of it.
And when doubting Thomas asked for reinforcements, it wasn't so much that he was all that lacking in faith. I just think he wanted to be absolutely sure after the death that they saw
that he wasn't getting played
in some kind of way. And the rest of them saw that and also touched him and ate with him. And also, of course, he spent more time with them later in Galilee. And large numbers of people, according to Paul, saw him. They knew it wasn't fake.
That's what you just took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say the list that Paul mentions, though, is not just the 12. He said that he was seen of above 500 brethren saw him, including Peter and all the 12 and James and the others and above 500 brethren saw him. So there was a whole bunch of people that saw him alive after the fact, even including the Apostle Paul that said, I was, one born out of due season, and I witnessed him, on the road to Damascus.
Let's read.
It's easy to think about them as being like a small group because it mainly mentions Jesus and the 12. Like it's only these guys going out. But then there's the other instance of him sending out a bunch more disciples. I forget how many it was, 40 or 50 or something by pairs or something like that.
Yeah.
How many was it?
I think it was 120, wasn't it?
120
number of disciples
60 by pairs. I don't remember exactly,
Maybe
but a large
70
number.
pairs, but
70
pairs. Would 70 pairs be 140? Oh, well, something like that.
Yeah, that's a huge group of people. And when you think, there's plenty of other qualified people around. Somebody like Stephen, with the power of the Spirit and the truth and all that, and motivated, he was good enough to make sure everybody got enough food. Like that's the kind of you had enough of those guys walking around that we got to pass out food. I mean, obviously he did a lot more than that, but Matthias, who took Judas's spot, and the other guy whose name sadly has slipped my mind at this point in time, it's a big group of people that we're talking about, even just at the core right there. And then come Pentecost, boom, it starts going exponential.
Yeah. Let's read John 20:17 as we move toward the end of the chart.
Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God."
In Leviticus 23:9-12, that's the wave sheaf offering. That's the first of the first fruit. It was the day after the Sabbath, because it was a Sabbath, so they'd bring in the first fruit, because that's kind of a work-like thing, and they would bring that to the high priest. Well, the real first fruits of God is Jesus Christ, the first one born in this new process, and the first of the first fruits. So Jesus is a real wave sheaf. The day after the Sabbath, that morning, he went to go to the real temple of God in heaven, present himself to the Father, and then come back down to earth to celebrate with his disciples. And that's the 18th of Nisan.
I wanted to make an observation. Jesus, we believe, was resurrected late on a Sabbath afternoon, right before the sunset, before Sunday actually began. We understand that from the scriptures we just read. He appears to the Mary and the disciples the next morning, Sunday morning, when they, she comes out of the tomb and she says he's not there. And of course, he has this encounter with Mary Magdalene, and eventually says, I'm he, because she said, if you laid him somewhere, tell me where. And she thought he was a gardener. The question or the observation that I make is, what did Jesus do between the time he was resurrected until Sunday morning? Because there's no evidence in the Bible. He had not ascended to the Father. And the only conclusion that I could come up with, you guys can put your thoughts in here, was on the night he was about to be crucified, he spent that night in prayer. There was a number of occasions, I believe, that he spent all night. It tells us that he spent all night in prayer. It's the only logical thing that I could think of that Jesus did once he was resurrected, was that he was there praying to God and telling him, thank you for bringing me back to life. And, you guys can put your thoughts in there, but I see that like a bookend from when he was, before he was crucified and after he was crucified. To me, it's the only logical thing before he would eventually ascend to the Father.
That's great insight.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's no evidence in the Bible of that, but I think that's probably what he did. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. It's certainly consistent with character, and like you said right before, and so many other times when it's mentioned, there's a lot to pray for right then. What a major step has been taken in the plan of God back towards reconciliation, and the growth of the church to pray about, all the people that are going to be instrumental in it, and look at all the problems that that arose in the New Testament church. I mean, we get a lot of good knowledge from problems that came up that had to be dealt with, and so we have all these examples and laid out for us, and all the men and women that were going to be involved with that. You know, there was a lot that was about to happen, a lot to be praying about.
I can imagine now that both of what you said got my mind thinking and thought about. I can imagine he'd be praying for the women who were the ones who maybe loved him the most that came to the tomb. Well, maybe they were less of a threat to the Romans as well. And maybe John was, because he was well known in high circles. But I imagine he prayed for the women. Then he prayed for the 12 disciples.
And I believe, you know, if you've ever gone through an enormous trial in your life, and we know that usually before the Passover, we go through these enormous trials every year, it seems to be the case. But when you come out of an enormous trial with victory, with winning in the end, and you overcome whatever you're faced with, sometimes you just want to go out in the yard and look up at the sky and just think how wonderful it feels on the other side of that. And I can see Jesus with those thoughts, I guess, but also the enormous adulation he must have felt of knowing that the people from the time of Adam till that day had forgiveness. He accomplished that great work, that great need for the whole world. And that had to have been enormous exhilaration for him to know that he had done it. And that would have been a moment for praising God and thanking him for the opportunity to save the world.
Absolutely.
And I like the bookend idea, because we know he prayed most of the night before he was taken, and then he prayed the night after he was resurrected. It does make sense, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Thanking God and praising God and praying for the disciples, because, you know, we think of those men as spiritual giants, but Christ saw them and they weren't that big as spiritual giants at that point.
Well, Jesus even prayed, you know, take this cup from me, because it was an enormous task at hand. You know, he was still, you know, he was human, you know, even though he was filled with God's Spirit and he was blameless, but he didn't open his mouth at his accusers. He took it on, and it was a heavy, you know, night for him to deal with. And I can just see the absolute relief of knowing, you know, he said in the book of Revelation, I'm he that is alive and was dead. And now he is, I'm alive forevermore. So it was an enormous victory for him. And I like to think that he was really exalted and moved by the whole experience. Mm-hmm. And I can't see how he wouldn't be.
And when we do the New Covenant Passover, it's kind of a remembrance. I know our remembrance is serious, but also we can be very thankful.
Boy, where do we start? Aren't you so very grateful for the Lord's Supper every year? You know, that we can come there on that night and feel recap some of these feelings we have when we read through the story and what it means for each of us. And it always is a moving experience.
Let's read John 13:12. Some of this we're going to read probably in the Passover service as well, but I think it's good to just go through it now. If you could read John 13:12, Ken.
So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, Well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them.
And this will be blessed if we keep the new covenant Passover. And if you're not baptized, just maybe you can plan to get baptized between now and next year. And you still should keep the Passover and wash feet. But then you can do the full service, wine and bread. Let's read.
Well,
go ahead.
Real quick, I want to interrupt you. Just seeing as how you mentioned baptism. There's a couple people in the chat room. Neil, who was baptized in a Sunday church. It looks like he's going to get baptized. I forget when he said, but soon, maybe this weekend. I'm not sure.
All right.
And then there's a woman in Australia that may be going to see Murray to get baptized.
All right.
Wonderful.
Cool.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Maria. So
That's wonderful. And by the way, in that Last Supper, he taught servant leadership, or it's a way to lead by serving others. Let's read John 14:1, please, Ken.
let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also.
And we're going to talk about being in covenant relationship with Christ in part 2. So I want to encourage people, if at all possible, get to a computer and watch part 2 next Friday. But that final sacrifice was greater than I think we imagined. And I always felt so unworthy. Of course, we're unworthy, I don't mean, but even if you had a better year than last year, you're still unworthy. But it just shows the generosity of God. But we also want to talk about some other aspects of it next weekend, because there's more to it than just getting God's grace. So that is obviously the big thing. And I think we can all learn more, even if you understand it well. We can all learn more about the sacrifice of Christ. And I think we learned a little more just from this program. Don't you think so?
Mm-hmm.
I
Good one.
certainly did.
I heard a couple things for the first time. I got to say, some insight there. It was good.
I knew this night was going to be good. This subject, when I saw the outline, I thought this is going to be a good topic, and I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we went through it.
Go ahead. I hope we pick up even more next weekend. Before we go, I did want to talk about the condition of the world. I recognize that it's a matter of what God's going to permit Satan to do. So I understand some things are subjective, and the speed in which they roll out is subjective. But I see American leadership being undermined in the world in a lot of places. And let's even take the sanctions that we put on the Russians, kicking them out of the banking system. Well, now that the banking system is looking weaker, the Russians may be saying, hey, it's not so bad being out of, the ruble is higher now than it was when we put the sanctions on them. And it would appear Europe is suffering more economically for the sanctions they put on Russia than Russia is for the sanctions. Does that make sense?
They might be happy right now to have a little bit less exposure to the Western financial system, considering some of the rumblings and stuff. I mean, that's not good news for anybody, I don't think. And that it has, I'm sure it has to some extent padded them from that a little bit, or made them, getting them going towards being safe and profitable and all that without it. The bombings and stuff in Syria, that's uncomfortable to have conflict heating up there. It probably in the last week and a half or so, we're doing drills in West Africa with soldiers from those nations, because there's a really serious militant threat. I mean, it's been going on in Nigeria specifically, but all across Africa. I mean, it's a state of virtual war in some places. I mean, it's hostile groups back and forth, and obviously we're back to the financial system, we back a lot of the governments down there, it's all deeply tied up financially and IMF loans and all this stuff. And that's all considered, it's all good. But if a different faction swoops in and topples the government, guess what happens to all of those obligations? And, that's what we're facing in the domestic front. When banks start falling, they start toop, everybody starts having to write off all this tremendous value. Well, that can happen in these other places as well. Lebanon hasn't been in good shape. If they're fighting in Syria and everything's ramping up around Israel, obviously that's bad. With Ukraine at the same time, it's just like there's stuff going on everywhere at once.
Yes, and we've known this for decades, that eventually the United States will fall, and it sure looks like it's getting closer. I mean, it really does. When you start seeing the banks that you talked about getting weaker and weaker, and the global mess. It's just an absolute mess.
Did you see the amount of money that Bitcoin lost? I mean, it's just, you're talking 350, $400 million, or, that just evaporated overnight. And I think of all the people that, they could have had, people could have had 50 or $100,000 million in that Bitcoin, and they lost it, their whole life savings overnight. It's just terrifying to see that kind of movement in the industry. And they interviewed some of these people that were out there in Silicon Valley Bank. Those people were scared to death. Some of them had millions of dollars in there, and their whole business was dependent upon that bank. And that the day it failed, it was like a wake-up call for these people who were so thinking that their life was going to go on and they had the money in the bank and things were going to go on. What I thought was, boy, that was like a wake-up call for all Americans. What happened if tomorrow all the banks failed? It'd be serious business. It would really be a wake-up call if tomorrow your bank couldn't, give you any money. And there wouldn't be anybody to back it up.
Into the globalist plan, actually.
And what's scary, that bank, the big bank in Switzerland that failed, heard that what happened was in the bank Swiss, I guess it's French, when that bank was about to fail, I guess the night before it became totally public, the government of Switzerland swooped in, pressured, I guess, their biggest bank to buy it, and then they later made them pay even more money for it. Because that's a big industry in Switzerland, banking. They got the very fact that a Swiss bank is about to go under. Some of it, like in the Silicon Valley Bank, they were doing woke things for 9 and 10 months when they clearly saw the Fed was going to and was actually upping interest rates, which they did Wednesday, I believe, again. And they did nothing. They just sat on those government bonds and did their woke stuff. I'm like, that's stupid banking. When you see things aren't working, you start getting out of that and changing it and selling it. And it's like stupidity among bankers. But there's another side of it that may be harder to figure out. The whole world was, most of the world used American currency. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world. Has been since World War II. Oil is traded in dollars called petrodollars. All that. And when they try to decide, because every country has a different currency, how are you going to value one currency against the other? They use the dollar as the metrics. Well, now there are countries that say, oh, the U.S. is abusing their dollar power, and U.S. is running up weird debts. And I think there is a movement from the BRIC countries. Obviously, China and Russia are leading the way, and Iran too, but Saudi Arabia is playing around with getting in on it. I will have to see. India has stopped using dollars for oil trades with Russia. They're buying them rubles or rubles, whichever, rupees and rubles, their currency instead of dollars. That is not good for America. And in a way, that's not good for the world financial system. Can you see it starting to unravel? I blame a lot of it on the Biden administration, but I guess I just never thought those. I think he, instead of hiring competent people, he hires people that are the first in some weird category.
Well, that's exactly what he's doing. I mean, it's all about the what's their words? I forget what they call them. but everything's got to be equity. Equity hires. Everybody's got to be equity. You don't have to have any competence. You don't have to have any knowledge in what you're doing. I mean, look at Pete Buttigieg or whatever. Look at him. I mean, he got not a single bit of experience in transportation, and they stuck him in charge of it. And how about the guy they stuck in charge of the nuclear waste? Mr. Fruity Pebbles there stealing people's luggage. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, and some of the others, they've had judges, and the Senate would ask them, well, what's the Brady rule? What's Article 2 in the Constitution? Wait, nobody was supposed to ask me any hard questions. I'm a Democrat. You're supposed to just vote me through. I don't have to know anything.
Exactly.
And literally, I'm not making it up, the level of incompetence the people in charge of our energy department are people that hate oil. In your job, supposed to be to acquire energy sources for America, and you know what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the world is slowly moving away from American leadership and from the dollar. I don't know how long it will take, but I say all that to say this. I think our best protection is in God. I'm not one of those that get you a shotgun and a couple of bags of beans and move to the country or survivalist. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm not even saying make a run on the banks or buy a bucket of gold. By the way, one of the first things the FDR did in the Great Depression was outlaw gold as currency. Just for those, So this idea that gold will save you, I'm not so sure that's true. I know I'm not against gold. I'm just saying all the easy answers that people think they have, I think only God can take care of us.
Absolutely.
I believe there's. Go ahead, Ken.
I was going to say, we know eventually gold's going to be of no value to us, but in the interim, it may be. But I'm watching the prices of it, and everything, gold and silver have both been up the last 4 or 5 days, fairly decent amount.
Yeah. Some people say silver is more usable because it has more uses than gold, but I guess whatever you think. I'm not against them. I'm just saying they're not a salvation in and of themselves. Nor is getting a big shotgun and a bag of beans and going out, because I had a guy this is many years ago in the church, and he came to our church to get a wife. I'm not making this up. This is in Nashville. He was going to the hills of Tennessee, get off the grid. He had a whole truckload of beans and some guns and says, and I'll be safe from all this mess. You see how kind of
he wasn't a Unabomber, was he?
We talk about all this stuff ramping up and how quickly things can happen, but it's good to keep in mind that we can only really know where we are now, and we have a kind of an idea of where things are going. We know it's going to be chaotic. We don't expect it's going to be American leadership in the world. Therefore, something has to happen. Something has to happen between now and then. Now, when you try to think from one to the other, it's logical to do it in the fewest possible steps. That doesn't mean that's exactly how it's going to play out, because you never know how these things are going to take shape and how long stuff can take. I mean, talking about, his disciples were expecting the kingdom right now. Christ said, next time I drink of the wine with you, it's going to be in the kingdom. And, boom, here we are. Over 2,000 years later, we're still talking about, Christ's kingdom and how close it is and all this stuff. And it is close. I'm not saying lose that sense of urgency, but don't be disappointed because you think it's happening right now and then it didn't happen. Be reasonable. Who knows? Fun, money's funny already. They're just making that stuff up already. So why can't they just keep making it up forever?
Well, that's the
reality
thing.
doesn't ever have to kick in, does it? Really?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's our monetary system is garbage. It's right now working on faith, because there is nothing. If a dollar is a measurement, like a gallon, right? So a dollar and a gallon or an ounce or a mile, they're all measurements. It's a dollar of what? You can have a gallon of gas, a gallon of milk, or a gallon of water, or an ounce of whatever, but you get a dollar of Nothing.
You get $1 of confidence in people's belief that this dollar has value, and that's the problem with some of these things that happen in bad policy and people being put in responsible decisions who are not really there to make expert decisions about that, but are there for some other ulterior motive. And you look at and you can see where that's going. People voting themselves with benefits and all that kind of stuff. And you look at like France right now, which is it's so chaotic. King Charles doesn't want to go there. It's going to be gross or it's not safe enough. Or both, something like that, right? But we're raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. Even a guy like Macron, who you wouldn't probably agree with on social issues and stuff, has enough facts and is conservative enough to say, oh, wait, this is unsustainable. We can't retire everybody at 62 with the demographics the way they are. Like, that's not how it's built. Population's not growing that fast anymore. Like, big time reality check that drove the people nuts, which shows you how much people care about number one mainly, right? It's me. It's like, I want my retirement, my money. I'm not working for 2 more years. It doesn't matter if the whole thing falls apart. And when you have that kind of selfish attitude behind all the decision makings, it will fall apart. And you're not going to convince me that hasn't happened in America, because that has happened.
Well,
wait till they find out 64 isn't sustainable.
Yeah, they'll find that out too in a few years. Yeah,
I think the teachers in America, teachers in Texas, they passed a law, or they're trying to pass a law where they get a $2,000 a year raise. They came back and said, well, we appreciate the offer, but we really want $15,000 a year raise. And I'm like, who gets a $15,000 a year raise across the board for all the teachers? It's impossible. We can't do that. We can't sustain that. And what are we going to have to give up in order to fund that?
They want to move minimum wage now to 20.
Oh my, yeah.
$20.
You can forget about having somebody load your lumber when you go to the lumber yard, Dan. You'll have to do it yourself, even though you already do it anyway. But
yeah,
you won't be able to afford any help.
Yeah, I am. And like you were saying, Michael, how fast this will happen. There's one thing that might delay it. And I say this, who knows? The alternative to the dollar is not there yet. The euro has problems. China still has some economic problems. And other parts of the world, Japan has some sort of banking debt crisis and a population problem too. For their Social Security. So in other words, the alternative is like Europe is crying for a great economic political leader to straighten out the mess, because the sanctions they put on Russia are hurting them more. But the alternative hasn't arrived yet. So the dollar.
Well, they've got it. They've got it. They're sitting on it. They're waiting to roll it out. And they're testing it in the banks now.
Oh, okay.
Digital currency.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. And obviously a no cash system in some ways is more vulnerable to bad manipulation and political control. So you would go from one pan to fire to, anyway, we shall see.
Well, no, absolutely, because then they can shut off your money. Well, you had enough meat this much, so you can't buy that hamburger at the grocery store. You can buy the bugs, you can get the cricket meat, but you can't get any beef this month.
Yeah, that's the kind of crazy stuff that they could do.
That's exactly
I'm not looking forward to that either. My point is, no place in the world politically is that ready yet. Now, maybe they will in a few months. And I think America has an advantage out of longevity. Wall Street has been and actually America's probably been the financial hub of the world ever since the Spanish-American War. The world didn't fully realize until after World War I, then more officially after World War II. So America's had time to be the number one economy in the world for all these years. But you can see the stage is set for it to fall. That's all I'm saying. How long it will take to fall, and when will the alternative become crystal clear? If you start seeing a great leader in Europe, that maybe if Europe falls apart and a great leader comes to put it back together, then I'd be worried.
Yeah.
But
if we know that we're headed down that road, then maybe some wisdom is involved in maybe doing something to, if it's obvious and you do nothing, then
So I see America declining, and we will decline. I'm praying that the next election will get a competent government and have a few more good years. And that's what I pray for. I'm probably wishful thinking, right?
You said competent government. That's
I mean,
good. I like
reasonably competent. I'm not asking for a miracle, just a competent government.
We can even pray for Joe to do better, because that guy needs all the help he can get. Seriously.
Oh my.
Yeah, I'm also praying that Joe's people will get themselves together, the ones that are behind him. Well, I know we're over time, and I want to thank everybody for sticking out to the bitter end.
Actually, the program went real good according to time, but we spent a good 15 minutes running on about the planet. So. I want to thank everyone for watching, and we hope to see you again here next week for part 2. So I will say good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Ken.
We're happy you could make it, and so glad you are here, and hope that we've been able to make God's word more clear. Until next time, may God be with you in everything you try. But for now, till next week, we have to say goodbye.